Today we continue our fall sermon series entitled Call to Adventure to the Promised Land. We'll follow the journey God's people make from Israel, from Egypt, to the Promised Land. The children of Egypt model the journey of adventure we're called to as well. Following in their footsteps, we'll discover lessons for traveling together as a community of faith. We're invited to accompany these forefathers and foremothers so that we might be encouraged, challenged, and transformed as we walk alongside them. They are our traveling companions, and under their guidance and direction, we will find new blessings as we sojourn together. Let us continue. As a reminder of where we have come and where we are traveling, here is Dan Harmon's story circle. This structure frames our series. Starting clockwise at the top, a character is in a comfort zone, but wants something. They enter an unfamiliar situation and adapt to it. They get what they want, but pay a heavy price. They return to their familiar situation, but they have changed. We began our journey in a place of comfort, complacency, and slavery. Our want for something more, better, different, and new placed our feet on the threshold of something greater. That something greater required we leave our ball and chain behind and step off the threshold. Freed to go into uncharted territory of the wilderness, we discovered a place of unexpected abundance and necessary adaptation. We realized that the clothes we had plundered from the Egyptians were ill-fitting in the wilderness. Today we enter stage 5, where Israel finds what it wants, gets what it's seeking. Paraphrasing Joseph Campbell, upon which Harmon bases his story circle, this stage is the center of the journey, the reason for Israel's journey and goal of their quest. All the prior steps prepare and purify them to encounter and be initiated by God, who has life and death power. Worshiping God was the original purpose of this entire journey. When God calls Moses to deliver Israel from Egypt, the sign of God's sending of Moses will be the people worshiping God on Mount Sinai. God tells Moses to ask Pharaoh's permission for the Israelites to journey 3 days into the wilderness to make sacrifices to the Lord. Moses comes to Pharaoh's court and says, "Let my people go, so that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness." Over successive plagues, Pharaoh attempts to negotiate with Moses, saying the people can go make sacrifices to God within Egypt or in the wilderness, provided it's not far away, or the men can go, but not children, or families can go, but not flocks. It's only after the death of the firstborn that Pharaoh allows them unconditionally to leave. Pharaoh illustrates that worship is unconditional, or it's not truly worship. Being selective in what we present to God isn't an option. Here's an unsettling question in hopes of movement. What areas of my life have I selectively withheld from God? How is my worship conditional? It's interesting that throughout these 10 plagues, not once does Moses ask Pharaoh to let the people go to the promised land. Their exiting is always for the singular purpose of worship. Without the story circle, we might think the primary purpose of the Exodus is to deliver God's people into the promised land. However, it would be mistaking the end of the story for the center. Before they can enter the promised land, they have to be shaped into a people after God's own heart. And that can only happen in a transformative encounter with God on Mount Sinai. God's goal in the Exodus was never merely a population transfer, but a population transformation. Without the latter, there can be no former. Such transformation can only occur by encountering and following God. Their time in the wilderness, where they're tested by thirst and hunger, helps prepare and purify them for meeting God on the mountain. Israel's encounter on Sinai is the pivot upon which the entire Exodus turns. It is the summit of the story, literally and figuratively. How do we ready ourselves to encounter God? What preliminary steps are necessary before placing ourselves in the presence of the Lord? There are 4 phases the Exodus shows us in approaching the holy. As the 10 plagues were preparation for Israel to cross the Red Sea, so Israel's sojourn in the wilderness has been preparation for Israel to arrive at Mount Sinai. God has been preparing them by being guided by pillars of fire and cloud so they can travel night and day. They've been prepared by being nourished by manna, quail, and water. They've been gifted by an humble leader in Moses and empowered by delegated and inspirited leadership of 70 elders who help Moses shoulder the burden of carrying the people. God takes a portion of the Spirit given to Moses and shares it with the elders. Instead of leadership modeled after Pharaoh and his officials, that's centralized, arrogant, and oppressive, Moses and the elders model leadership that's covenantal, humble, and just. Israel has been cohered by a 3-month journey together. A question: how am I preparing myself weekly and daily to approach God? Those preparatory steps usher the people into Sinai, where they camped in front of the mountain. Now in the valleys surrounding Mount Sinai, they enter a different phase, that of approaching God. They're in the vicinity of the holy mountain where God first called Moses in a burning bush. and now must be readied for their own encounter. To approach the holy mountain requires they be purified, consecrated for 2 days before meeting God on the third. That consecration involves washing their clothes and avoiding physical relations. Holy areas of the mountain were demarcated in advance, as well as holy times whose long trumpet blast signaled it was safe to approach. To ensure the people encounter God, Moses, as a holy guide, escorts them out of camp to meet God. A question: what holy guides has God placed in my life? And whose lives has God placed me in as a guide? Because Israel has been consecrated, they're now able to approach and now encounter God. It is a memorable, multi-sensory, and mind-boggling meeting. It is a visual spectacle: lightning, thick cloud, fire, and smoke, and God coming down in the sight of all the people. It is an auditory deluge. Thunder, so people hear God speak to Moses, and a trumpet blast so loud everyone trembled. It's a kinesthetic cacophony felt in the body. The whole mountain shook violently. And afterward, the people went up on the base of the mountain. Every person in Israel had this incredible encounter with the Lord. Moses, Aaron, his 2 sons, and 70 elders had an even more significant, more magnificent meeting higher up with the Almighty. They saw God. And under God's feet, a clear pavement of sapphire stones, and they ate and drank. A question: what past encounters with God continue to sustain me today? As God's goal for the Exodus isn't a population transfer, but something greater, so God's goal for this psychedelic theophany on Sinai is more than awing Israel with God's power and presence. Sinai was never merely an awe-inspiring theophany, but the founding of a priestly kingdom and holy nation. God's majesty on the mountain wasn't an end in itself, but a means to an end. Moses' glowing face was not for himself, but so that Israel might become a light unto the nations. As an agent of transformation, Sinai's purpose was to indelibly inscribe upon the hearts of Israel a new way of living outside of Pharaoh's anxiety. Walter Brueggemann's Journey to the Common Good says God's generosity in the wilderness freed Israel from Pharaoh's anxiety about scarcity. Israel's now able to turn attention away from themselves and toward the common good. They had experienced a world where everyone had enough, no matter how much they gather, and can consider its implications for themselves beyond the wilderness and for others beyond the promised land. God's generosity creates such a spirit of generosity in Israel that even before Moses explains any of the commandments, the people of Israel say as one, everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do. They did so because they knew that the commands of an abundant God were better than any commands from an anxious Pharaoh. Brueggemann says we need to rethink the intention of the Ten Commandments. They are not rules for deep moralism. They are not common sense rules designed to clobber and scold people. Rather, they are the most elemental statement of how to organize social power and social goods for the common benefit of the community. They voice Yahweh's dream of a neighborhood, Yahweh's intention for the common good. Commandments 1 to 3 are where Israel learned Yahweh is to be loved, served, and trusted instead of Pharaoh's security system. Israel learned from Commandments 5 to 9 that all kinds of neighbors are to be respected and protected, not exploited. Neighbors are ends and not means. Israel learned from the 10th commandment that there's a limit to acquisitiveness. It's not about petty acts of envy, but predatory practices and aggressive policies, making the little ones vulnerable to the big ones' ambitions. Israel learned from the 4th commandment that Sabbath rest is an alternative to aggressive anxiety. Sabbath isn't about worship, but work stoppage and refusing to let one's life be defined by production and consumption and endlessly pursuing private well-being. The God of Sinai wants energy invested in the neighborhood, not self-securing to get ahead like the empire. Sabbath is an occasion for community enhancement, for eating together and remembering and hoping and singing and dancing and telling stories, all exercises that have no production value. Israel learned in the 4th commandment there's a viable way to organize the neighborhood outside the rat race. The 10 Commandments are a charter for a new kind of community, a demonstration project where God's dreams for human community are manifested in the life of Israel. God is innovating and disseminating a vision and reality of human life outside of anxiety, scarcity, captivity, and the anger, fear, aggression, and violence that come with it. Imagine what such a community could look like. How exhilarating, thrilling, and breathtaking would that be? That's why Israel wholeheartedly says yes, even without knowing what those commandments would be. Moses, being a good mediator, wants to make sure Israel is fully apprised of their commitment. He builds an altar at the foot of the mountain and tells them all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. And they reply, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Moses then reads the book of the covenant and they say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. To permanently mark their commitment to this new kind of community, Moses takes a sacrificial gift from the oxen. As Israel stands before him in their washed and consecrated clothes, Moses dashes basins of blood upon them, the blood of the covenant that God has made with them. By keeping the commandments, they'll be God's treasured possession, priestly kingdom, and holy nation. They've been given the gift of the law in order to fulfill God's promise made to Abraham. I will make of you a great nation, and in you all families of the earth will be blessed. Israel's chosenness of getting what they wanted was never for self-congratulation, but for others' consecration. They were made a holy nation so that other nations could become holy. They were made a kingdom of priests so that other kingdoms could become sanctified. They were made a great nation so that other nations could become greater. They were made the people of God so that all peoples could become so. They were made a treasured possession to be poured out so that all families on the earth could become blessed. They had received God's gift of food and drink in the wilderness. They had received God's very presence on Mount Sinai. And now the world was ready to receive God's gift of human community through Israel. This is an adventure you don't want to miss. Stay tuned. Amen.